Okay. Were you going to lead or am I going to lead?
No, you should go first because I want to make sure I get to talk about you afterwards.
The rebuttal.
Yes,
okay.
That's right.
So today's speakers will be Beavis. This will be myself and Mark Michaelis. Mark tends to not brag about his resume, but he is a Microsoft Regional Director. He is the head honcho here at Intellitech. He's a fairly smart person when it comes to all things C# and knowledgeable, author of the Essential C# book series. If I missed anything else important?
Definitely not. You've said
mediocre
way too many things that are not
mountain
important.
biker, only occasionally crashes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Kevin holds the distinguished position of the first person that Intellitech hired who did not actually get hired the first time. He had to interview several times before we decided to hire him. And I think really what I'm saying when I say that is actually we made a mistake. We didn't realize how good Kevin was during that first interview, so we had to sort of tweak our interview process to make it better, so we could actually let Kevin in the door. Kevin has been truly phenomenal in the impact that he's made, both here with us as individuals within the company, but certainly within the last several years, his impact on the C# and .NET community is incredible. He is an MVP for Microsoft. I think it's your third year. Is that about right?
Yes.
Third year as Microsoft MVP. And he actually spends quite a bit of time writing some of the source code that goes into the .NET framework, things like system.command line. So he's fairly integrated into Microsoft and what they're doing. And if you ever want to know sort of the details or high level about technology and development, Kevin is a key person to interact with. So I have great respect for Kevin, in spite of what his friends tell me.
Excellent. Now, as I'm sure everybody's looking forward to it, we've only got about 60 more slides, but no. We are done with slides.
Thank goodness.
Slides done. What everybody came here to see. Code, C# specifically, because that's the interesting part of this.
So to start out, it's an interesting topic for us to sort of talk about nullability. This is a problem. This has been a part of the language since C# 1.0, and you'd think that it was sort of a solved problem. Like, why are we even having a talk on nullability? Surely this is known and figured out. And it turns out when Microsoft started talking about, or started the C# language, they introduced this concept of null, and it was just considered sort of taken for granted. Of course you should have null, and of course all types should be able to represent and store null. But it turns out in hindsight, as we go back, I don't think that our understanding of nullability and the concept of nullability was necessarily correct when we started designing C#. It was just assumed all languages did this, all languages that were C#-like, meaning curly braces and the like, they were sort of considered, oh, you've got to have the concept of null. But it turns out that we defaulted data types to not store, to allow things to be null by default. And the end result is inevitably your code was littered with null reference exceptions, and there is never a case where a null reference exception is not a bug unless you wrote the framework. So in the one case where they actually decided, hey, we should throw a null reference exception because it is a null reference exception, that is the only case where throwing a null reference exception is correct. All other cases where you throw a null reference exception in your code are a bug. You did something wrong, somewhere there was a failure because you're not giving a more meaningful message. So to start out, we sort of have this problem with nullability. And now we're in a world where the C# language has improved, and I mean that sincerely. I think the C# language has improved, and our concept of nullability has changed. But we've had to sort of deal with the legacy that's been a part of C# and go through transitions in the language to support a better and better concept of nullability. And the end result is that we've sort of got a mesh or an in-between world. It's not perfect, but it's better than it was. But there's a bunch of idiosyncrasies that we sort of have to think through. Mm-hmm. And probably the first one to think about is the fact that we can go decorate a value type and a reference type with a question mark. And while that seems completely logical, that seems to make a lot of sense, now they can both store null, it turns out that that simple concept of having value types and reference types both be represented with a question mark to indicate that they could store null introduced a whole host of problems. And so we're going to sort of talk through that. The beginning of this is fairly obvious for those of you who are programming in C# for a long time, but we just want to make sure the fundamentals are well understood. So to start out, what is the difference between a reference type that's decorated with a question mark and a value type that's decorated with a question mark? How are those two things different?
Here's a hint.
The value type is actually just shorthand for nullable the nullable generic of that.
Yeah, so to start out, when you decorate a value type with a question mark, the data type is now a different type than it would have been otherwise. In fact, when you decorate something like an int with a question mark, you then are changing the data type declaration to be a nullable of type int. So the concept of a value type decorated with a question mark is to actually change the type to be a generic nullable of that type, as I'm sure Kevin has gone and created right there. So date time. So that is the equivalent when you do date time question mark. That's the equivalent of typing, if you can go and do this, nullable of date time. We did it, sorry, nullable of date time. Great. So what is it when I decorate a reference type such as string with a question mark? What is that?
Besides a compiler warning.
So one idea is it's a breaking API change. In what way is the API breaking?
It can now accept different input.
Can now accept different input than before. We got to repeat. There's
Yeah,
some
no,
people
that's a
who
good
can't
point.
hear
So
Kelly.
it's a great point. So one suggestion is that by decorating with a question mark, it's a breaking API change. And the question is, how is it breaking? And the answer is, well, we're now doing something that's now it's a different data type. And other comments about, so I'm not going to comment whether that's true or false, but I'd like to hear other people's input on what are we doing when we decorate a reference type with a question mark.
We're declaring our intentions.
We are declaring, and I love this word. So Seth says here, we're declaring the intention. In this case, the intention is what?
That this value can contain null.
The value, when we decorate with a question mark, we're saying that now this data type, in this case string, could contain null. Now, for those of you who haven't been programming with C#8 or later, you should be very concerned, and legitimately so. Because string, since very first version of C#, could always store null. And unlike the concept of an int, which could never store null, when we added the question mark, an int still can't store null. We instead changed the declaration to be nullable of int. When we decorate a string with a question mark, we are only declaring to the compiler that we have the intention that it could store null, which implies what does a string actually represent on its own without the question mark? Something meaningful, okay. A bit more information. What does a string without a question mark mean?
That it can't be null.
So,
Except for
yeah, so the comment was, when you decorate a string without a question mark, we're saying it can't be null, except for the fact that it can.
and because all code previously could be null.
And
Now-
if you're upgrading from C#7 or earlier into C#8, it is always being able to store by default, not only by declaration, but by default, the default value for a string is null. So here we're saying, wait, I don't get it. We have a string, we can declare it as intentionally, or my intent is that it can store null, or we can declare without a string, which is now that it can store null, but that's not true because it can always store null. So what exactly are we saying when we say a string is nullable or is decorated with a question mark? And the key feature, as I said, the key thing you want to think about here is it's about the intent. What do you intend? And it's not that a string, without the question mark, can't store null. It's that you are saying, my intention, without the question mark, is you will not put null in. And if I, as the compiler, can figure out that you're storing null into the string, then I'm going to give you a warning. I'm going to give you an error. I'm going to say, hey, something's wrong. You said the intent was I wasn't going to have null, but you've now gone ahead and assigned null. And the whole concept of intent is really important, and it's an intent of what can the compiler figure out when you are conforming to your declared intent versus what the compiler can figure out what you're doing. So when the compiler can say, you intended not to store null, meaning no question mark, but you are assigning null, then I'm going to go and flag and say, wait a second, you're not following the intent. And the ability for us to decorate things with reference types with question mark is allow us the ability to do a declare the intent. Is there something we need to do in our source code to allow us to declare intent?
Yes, there is. So just as a quick comment, we are not only kind of throwing nullable reference types in here, but we've also decided bleeding edge is the way to go. So there was a new version of Visual Studio that dropped earlier today. Naturally, we installed it. Of course. We also
We've had several hours.
Yeah, it's had several hours. If there was going to be a bug, we probably would have seen it. But we're also throwing some C# 10 in the mix as well. So just to call out just a few kind of minor things. For example, the C# 10, you no longer have to put curly braces around your namespaces, which is kind of cool. So rather than always being indented one level, we can now be unindented.
And one comment I'd make about
the applause moment.
One comment I'd make about this as we start to introduce some of these things not only we can do, but I would argue that they're good enough features that we should always do them. So in this case, it's hard for me to imagine a case when you wouldn't declare your namespace without the curly braces. It's extremely rare, if ever, that you go ahead and declare two namespaces within the same file. So now with file-based namespace, so we just declare it at the top, you don't put curly braces, it's called a file-based namespace declaration. We can do that once, and we will probably always do that, and I expect all code going forward that supports C# 10 or later will just dump the curly braces, and that gives us an additional 4 characters on the line before we reach the 180 code maximum, so that's really important.
So the other thing to note is once you get onto the latest framework, so .NET 6 and up, when you go ahead and do .NET New, what you're going to end up with is a project that actually by default Nullability turns on. So Nullability is not on by default just by targeting .NET 6, but if you do the .NET New, the new project templates have it on by default. So the moment you decide that it's time to go in greenfield development, brand new project, just be aware this is going to be on with all of your .NET New commands going forward at least.
And adding that text, enable nullable, the nullable element, is what allows us to go declare reference types that have a question mark after them where we declare in the intent. If you don't have nullable and you put the question mark in, it's going to give you a warning and say, hey, wait a second, you're intending to allow nullable reference types, but you haven't yet turned it on. Please go turn the feature on. There is another way to turn it on in the file.
There is. So specifically, if you're going through and doing upgrades, there is the #nullable. And this has both enable, disable, and restore as options for it. So specifically, if you're going through and upgrading an existing code base, there's sort of 2 paths forward. You either flip it on at the project level and then go through and do nullable, disable on all your files, or you go the other way around where you leave it off at the project level and do nullable enabled on each of the files as you address it. That way you can attack the warnings one at a time. Specifically, if you have warnings as errors turned on, this is a great way to all of a sudden get tons of errors all over the place. So just be aware with that. Typically, going through and updating old stuff, it's my opinion that it is much easier to turn it on at the project level, turn off all of the files, simple PowerShell script or something to just rip through your C#, put nullable disabled on there, and then go back and change it.
Because
then you're moving forward. If you go the other direction, you end up with a situation where after you've turned nullable enable on all your C# files, you then have to go back through all the C# to scrape this out once you're actually ready to turn it on at the project level. Kelly. Can you do it at a per method level? Absolutely. So the #nullable enabled, you get to pick where you want it. So you can turn nullable enabled, and then, for example, nullable, well, you'd probably do either restore or disable at this point, but you can go through and wrap whatever you want in it.
I thought there was an
Attribute as well? Not for turning the nullability feature on and off. There are attributes that we'll come to later, but not that are feature switch on-off level things.
So you can do it at the project level, which means you can also do it by the command line. By definition, you can go add a nullable element to the command line. You can do it at the file level by just putting it at the top, or you can do it at a line block or a line scope level to go ahead and turn it on.
One other thing too, you'll note now that we've turned it on, it's immediately jumped us. The warnings that we were getting before on the question mark, before, if you go and tack that question mark onto a reference type without the feature turned on, that will prompt you with a compiler warning. The compiler realizes, hey, you're probably trying to use the nullable reference type feature. You don't actually have it on here. What are you doing?
one of the cautions, I completely think Kevin's right. In fact, I'd say more universally, it makes much more sense for you to turn it on at the project level and then turn it off in every file using a PowerShell script. And then every single time you go into a file to start editing, go ahead and update that file to support nullability. The key thing to realize is that turning on is not good enough, because turning it on has significant impacts on your code. Specifically, the case is that when you go ahead and turn it on, you have now said that whenever you've used a string without the question mark, which wasn't supported earlier, you're also saying that now that it's not a question mark, my intention is that this is not going to be null. So in your original code base, your intention was every single reference type is null by default. When you turn this on, you've also said, hey, now every file is non-nullable default, which probably isn't correct. And so part of doing this, and why we say you do it at a file level, is you edit the file, you turn it on, you started by you turning the project on, you then go into all the files, you turn it off in all your files. Then when you go into a file to start editing, as part of turning it on for that file, you want to go examine each of the data types and decide whether you want them to be nullable or non-nullable at an API level. So look at obviously all your public APIs, but even your private APIs, and make a choice about all the data types declared within that file and make a choice, is it nullable or not nullable. And that's, the alternative, okay, well, let's just take every reference type and decorate with them a question mark, is probably not what you want to do. It's way harder to go back and update those if you do that. So I think the suggestion is do this at the scope with which you can handle. And one of the advantages, if you have really long files, is you can go ahead and take an entire block or entire class and mark that as nullable enabled or nullable disabled, depending on what you want, and then go ahead and through a progress of updating it. I can't imagine, starting with C#8, I can't imagine starting a new project without having nullable enabled. And now, starting with Visual Studio 2022, that is the default when you start a .NET 6 project. I think even earlier, in fact. When you start a new project, the templates for the project will go ahead and create it as a nullable for .NET 6 going forward.
.NET 6 and forward,
Yeah.
certainly. I don't think it was set there before.
Yeah, well, it definitely wasn't set there before, but I would turn it on. So any new project you create, I would go ahead and turn that on.
Yeah, and something worth noting, I've upgraded several larger projects to turn on nullable reference types. The first 80% is really easy, because most of the time it's pretty easy to look down at your method, look at your code, and decide, hey, should this be nullable, yes or no? It gets, the last 20% takes as long as the first 80%. So just be aware, when you think you're 80% done, you're about halfway. So just be aware of that.
So obviously, to start out, we've got a whole bunch of warnings, and we'll deal with them all by the end of the talk, but I want to focus on a couple things about the source code and sort of dealing with sort of null, because it turns out that the way we do null programming has sort of changed throughout C#. So to start, one of the questions that we often encounter with when we start to write our code is, how do we check for null? And so suggestions from you guys, what are some of the ways that you might want to go check whether something is null or not? This is just a list, like just a brain dump of how many ways can you check whether something is null? What was that? You could do an if statement, yep. And inside the conditional, what would you put? Oh my goodness.
Ignore IntelliCode.
That's terrible.
Ignore
I can't believe
IntelliCode.
In this case,
IntelliCode is awesome. In this case,
wow, that's just
there's
really bad.
one option.
That was just really bad. Okay.
So there's
Is null. So Seth mentions you can actually go if am I null is null. So starting with C#8, you can actually, and pattern matching, you can go and actually, was it actually earlier than that? 7, doesn't matter.
Earlier.
You can actually go just ask the question, is it null? Okay. So it's the is not, you can't do is not. You could do not is object.
Hold on. Is that what you're proposing, Kelly? That total, so C#9 with the new not expression, totally legit. Okay. Yeah, sorry, I'm hearing two things.
Curly braces was next.
Curly braces.
Value types.
So there's this guy here.
Which you can do a not as well, since we're checking for not null.
Well, this is not null. This only matches. So this is a property expression, and it matches any non-null objects.
These ones we're actually asking which is null.
Oh, which is null. Sorry. Okay, fine. We'll put a not in front of it.
Okay. Others?
This is a string, so we can do string dot is null or empty.
No, that's true. We've got
Or white space.
yeah. So I will do one. I will do one of them, and we'll just say that any of these static methods on string, because
Fair
there's
enough.
3 of them.
Kevin, will you repeat that comment?
Sorry. So the static methods on string of string is null or empty, string is null or white space, etc. Thank
Okay.
you.
Others?
It's a remarkably good set.
Try to get it and catch it.
Austin, I'm going to pretend like so. I'm hesitant to repeat this
suggestion
because
was,
somebody may
go
actually.
ahead and throw an exception and see if there was one.
So I mean, yeah. So I mean, yes.
Okay, good. What else? Yeah.
This is bad. This might get added to the calamities talk.
yeah, we
Don't do
think,
this.
yeah. Another one. There is
This is
one.
not a good
There's
one.
one common one that we.
Exception handling is scope flow?
Yeah, so you can go ahead and do a conditional, which is a little bit different, but it does exactly work the way you're suggesting. So here we can go ahead and do a null coalesce using the question mark. To go and say, hey, if it's null, then go ahead and set it to equals. Great. Any others?
What is there's a new one that, like on a property of an object, you could say object question mark dot property.
Oh yes. So the new one, I believe, what you're referring to
Non-conditional
is yeah.
It's not a,
So basically,
yes.
similar to that.
The null conditional
operator.
null
yes.
conditional operator, correct.
It says ternary
Oh.
question mark?
No, so ternary, so yes, I'm tracking with you, Bruce. So the only issue there with the ternary is you still end up having to do a null check beforehand.
We're still doing the same thing. We've got that one covered, which you would not
So-
use an equals here.
That's
But
just differently than the if statement.
yeah. I'm not. Yeah.
I'm putting. I won't quite
Put
put
that
it
in
down.
comments.
Yeah, I won't put it down next to Austin's
Others?
suggestion.
What is affectionately known as the Damon operator.
The null forgiveness operator.
The null
was
forgiveness
another
is-
suggestion, which in actual fact is not checking for null. There's nothing that it's doing that's checking for null.
Yes.
So yes, it is an operator. We need to be thinking about it, but it's not. There is no null check in there. It will throw.
It will throw.
It will throw. It just won't give you a compile warning. So it's not.
Yeah.
It is not doing anything besides communicating with the. So the comment about the null forgiveness operator, the exclamation point, is it won't throw. In actual fact, it will. It only tells the compiler to shut up. It doesn't do anything else besides tell the compiler that you know better. But the runtime will still check and validate it.
Because there's sometimes that the compiler knows, hey, you've done a null check, so it knows whether it's null. There are some things you can do that it doesn't know that you've done that check.
Yes.
You can say, I've done the check.
Yes.
Define it.
Yeah, so the comment was when to use the null forgiveness operator, and rather than go into all the ideas that were shared, we'll get into this a little bit more later, so I'm just going to hold off on that. There's an equals method that's fairly common. If you guys are familiar with an equals method? In particular, a version of the equals method that happens to be static.
You can also pattern match it into a non-nullable.
They have really crazy ideas today.
So the comment was we could also pattern matching it into something.
So, hang on. MaybeNull
But we're still using pattern matching. So the comment was you can do pattern matching, but it's going to use pattern matching on one of the ways we've already looked at evaluating whether something is null or not already.
Yeah.
So it's not. I agree with you, but we're using pattern matching already, using an if statement rather than like a switch or something. But it's still pattern matching. We're not doing anything different. So back to something about an equal statement, a static method that has equals on it, fairly
There's a
common.
hint.
It's been there since C# 1.0.
Here's a hint. Right?
Or reference equals.
We'll get there. We'll get there. I've got all day.
No, we don't.
Fair. That's how many ways there are to check whether we are null. Have we missed any? We're just going to pretend like the try catch is off the screen and not there.
So the reason why we went through this exercise is it turns out we're checking for null all the time, and there's a myriad ways to doing it. And as you go ahead and write the code, which one is right? Now, I'm going to just start out by let's eliminate the question mark and the question mark period. And, let's eliminate those. So let's look at the top set that Kelly's got there. So lines 37 all the way through 50.
I go by Kevin most days, but
Kevin,
I'm flattered that you think I'm Kelly.
I did not mean to insult either of you.
I'm flattered. I don't know what Kelly feels.
I assure you, I can come up with worse names.
That's
okay.
not the first name you
So
called
look
me
at the first set of lines there, 37 through 50. Which is best, and why?
I like 39 because I can explain it to my wife.
Sorry, 39 is now 40.
There was a preference for line 40. There you go. So that's one. What's the advantage over some of the others? Any particular advantages? There's something that makes there's something that makes it better in important ways that are different than the equals equals.
And here we'll just cut a few of the options out because obviously string has a few extra perks, but we can narrow it down and just go with generic reference type.
Well, you could have that weird class of bug where you just use one equals and do assignment, which always returns true.
And that
So potentially
that only works for Boolean because you're going to get a compiler in C#.
Yeah, so where some people like to write their constant on the left instead of the right to dodge that, but you were right. In C#, the only constant that it matters with is Booleans.
Yeah. Can you change what equals equals does?
Yeah, you override that operator.
Yeah, so one of the things that you should be aware of is that somebody could override the equals equals operator by overriding equals, and in so doing, or usually that's the implementation, in so doing they could change the performance ramifications of checking for equal, and for that reason you can't override the is operator. So you can't override is null, and I would suggest from both the perspective of readability and from the perspective of avoiding somebody overriding it and therefore introducing some kind of performance implication or something like that, I would almost always choose to use the is operator either with is null or is not null, depending on which way you're checking, as the preferred way to go ahead and do this, assuming you're trying to do some kind of conditional check on it. I also think that from readability, Kelly's point was his spouse could go ahead and read this, or somebody that's not familiar with C# could go ahead and read the source code because it's almost English. Hey, is this null or is it not null? And it's much easier to read.
Yeah, from an implementation standpoint, it's worth noting that the equals equals operator and the equals method, because those things are invoked one from the other, because that's virtual, if all you're checking for is null, typically you don't want somebody's overridden equality for a null check. If what you really are concerned with is this reference null? Now, obviously most people, and I'm sure nobody here would do this, write an equals method where you check against null and for whatever reason it decides to do something wacky and oh, we're equal to null when we aren't. That's a thing you could do. You shouldn't, but it is a thing you can do.
We're not doing a talk next week, next month.
Yeah, not currently.
So the only caveat is you're limited to when the is null operation is supported. So this didn't come out, wasn't actually possible to do this until more recent versions. I think in 7, you couldn't do this. But assuming you're programming with any modern version of C#, I can't imagine a case where you wouldn't want to do is null or is not null, depending on which way you're checking.
And you can double check the IL if you don't believe me, but is null will go down to the same IL instructions as a reference equals null, which is highly performant and guarantees that it is actually checking the instance against null. So if that's your intent, by far, 42, look at that, see?
Oh, that is, I'm so impressed. That's just amazing, right? The answer to life, the universe, and everything, right there is line 42. Did you do that intentionally?
No, but we should really script it.
We should really try to do that. That was really
perfect timing.
That was very impressive. maybe we should actually start changing the line numbers based on where the right answer is. So then people who know have
So
seen us talk before,
here's the
they could
hint.
actually
Everything
know.
will be on that line.
Yeah, exactly. From now on, we just automatically adjust the line numbers. Okay. Great. So let's go up and do something really simple. Like let's write a property that's non-nullable.
Really simple, like write a property that's
something
non-nullable.
really simple. So
Look, I've got a property. It's non-nullable.
nice job. That's
I'm
fantastic.
done.
Don't you have is there no warning there? Nothing like that? That's not causing any problems?
Well, I've got a lot of warnings, so let me clean up this.
Should we make the code compile as well?
Yeah, let me clean up this. This is kind of a mess. So let's make the mess go away, because I think right now the compiler. So once you get rid of the WAT, the compiler starts doing its job.
So since C# 1.0, you could go ahead and type no, actually that's not true. It wasn't possible in the earlier versions, but I think 2 or 3, we could go ahead and write an auto-implemented property, and you'd go ahead and declare it as public string last name get init. The problem is once we introduce nullable reference types, which allows a type to be declared by declaration to say that you don't want it to be null, you've got a problem, because you're now by default having last name in this case be null, but you've told us it's not nullable. And so the compiler is going to give us a warning and saying, hey, you've said that your intent is last name is not nullable, but you're not initializing. And so to start out, we've gone through, we've carefully examined the types and say, you've got a type that's not being initialized. What do you want to initialize it to, either within your constructor or within an assignment as part of the declaration? What are you going to go ahead and do? And you think, okay, no big deal. Let me just go ahead and change this. First of all, string is relatively easy because you can assign it to a literal. So if there is a literal default that makes more sense, like an empty string, that would be great. But it turns out, not only are we saying that a string should not be nullable, but presumably a space is not a reasonable default for that value either. So it makes reasonable sense that we're saying, hey, this has to be assigned within the constructor. And I think this is a general comment. When we think about saying if something cannot be nullable, we should also be interpreting that there must be some type of initializer for this type that we're declaring as not nullable. Otherwise, we will end up in a state for the object, in this case person, that has invalid data by default when you instantiate it. And so one of the things we want to do is that we want to create objects in such a way that when they escape the constructor, when this constructor finishes, the object is in a totally valid state rather than invalid state by default, and we want to force you to go ahead and put a constructor in. So if we wanted to go ahead and initialize, are we going to do this with first name or last name?
Let's start with first name.
Okay.
That one sounds fun.
If we want to go ahead and initialize first name, we go ahead and expand it out to a full property, but you notice we have a warning. So we would think this is so simple. The language has gone ahead and defined, we want to create a data type, we want to make it not nullable, we want to initialize in the constructor. So we go ahead and expand out first name to be a fully implemented property, meaning there's a getter and there's a setter and there's a backing field. So we've gone ahead and done that implementation. It's right there for you. And you'll see, furthermore, we're doing some additional stuff with property change. You can ignore that for now. But we've got this property. But we're not actually doing any kind of validation regarding nullability. So we're saying first name can't be null, but there's no validation on first name. We need to go ahead and do that validation. And second of all, we've got a warning. Up on line 14, when you hover over first name, we're getting the warning that says, hey, you've told me it's non-nullable, it's not declared with a question mark, but there's a warning, and assuming you got compilers turned on as errors, we got to get past this. How do we get rid of the warning? Suggestions?
I delete all the code.
That will get rid of the warning. That would
It's the
work-
only
that
way I
would work.
found to write perfect code.
How do we get rid of the warning where it says, hey, you got to go ahead and initialize first name?
Initialize it
Initialize it to what?
to whatever the appropriate value is.
In this case, so sorry, I'm not actually repeating what's being said. So the comment is, let's go ahead and initialize it. What should we initialize the value to? The obvious choices, in this case, we're not going to know, so let's go ahead and force the compiler the constructor to provide us a value for what we're going to go ahead and assign to name. Now, if there was some valid default, you could do angle brackets, default angle brackets. You could do that. But then as soon as you localize it, you got a problem. Now you got to worry about localization and things like that. Reese?
Empty string is valid?
Well, generally, empty string wouldn't be considered valid on a first name. It would be hard for me to imagine people with first names of empty string. That seems relatively invalid. I'm sure there are cases. I'm not sure even Prince could be said to have a first name of invalid, but space is probably not the best choice. And more importantly, when we look at reference types in general, most reference types don't have literals that can be assigned from the compiler. For example, if we said person, there's no default that I could go ahead and make for person to go, because there's no literal interpretation of that. So now I've got to go in and instantiate a constructor, pass in a value, and what are the valid values I'd give for that? It's unclear. So in this case, I think it's reasonable to say, let's go ahead and pass first name in on the constructor. And so Kevin's going to put a constructor in, he's passed a value of first name, and he's going to assign it to the first name. Are we done? What's the error on person there, Kevin?
It's unhappy that the first name field must contain a non-null value, and then last name. So, see here, watch this. Boom.
Yeah, that's good. So you could have code as long as it's commented out, and then you can still have perfect code?
Correct.
Okay, good. Got it.
Commented code has rarely thrown a null reference.
In this case, we've gone ahead and instead of it highlighting underscore first name, it's now highlighting person, but it's the same error. Hey, you're continuing to do stuff, but you're not additionalizing first name. Now, obviously at this point, we could go ahead and assign first name, the value of first name. We could assign underscore first name, the value of the first name parameter that's being passed in. Does this solve all our problems? From a compiler warning perspective, yes, we are solved. However, there's a very important characteristic that we have missed in the sense that the data type for string still allows null. This is really important. Even though we've turned on nullability and we've declared our intent for what a string should be, underneath the covers, when you look at the IL, which Kevin will demonstrate, the IL for string is still the same string as it was in C# 1.0. It is still a reference type. The default value is still null. We have not done anything besides declare our intent, and there is no check. So even though we're saying first name is not intended to be null, there is no check by the compiler that it is or is not null at runtime, or even compile time for that matter. There's a check by the compile time to give you a warning, but there's no actual check of the value. If you look at the IL, which Kevin is pulling up, your font's still going to need to be bigger.
Oh, details, 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 details. I've got Zoom it turned on though.
That's something that, even though I know it, I get tripped up, that it's nullable is the compiler thing, not a language thing.
Yeah, so the comment was, we often forget that compilable is a compiler thing, a nullable is a compiler thing, and a language thing, not a runtime thing. So the only difference in the way that string is declared is there's an attribute on there.
Sorry, where are you wanting me to show?
I don't care, anywhere.
I was showing the property.
Great, property is
so the
fine.
key part, the thing to note is, wow, let's just pretend like I can draw a line, that it is still the normal string, nothing fancy. I think what you are looking for is something along the lines of
the parameter on the constructor, there we go.
That little thing there, all right? You are looking to show.
So you'll notice that on the constructor, it's now decorated with additional metadata that indicates that it is nullable, but it is metadata only. There is no code, no procedural code. It's just declaring your intent so that other source code that uses your libraries knows what your intent is that you're not passing null. However, if you decide to pass null either intentionally or by mistake, no validation will occur. It's an important characteristic. Even though our intent is that null, this can't be null, there's nothing that's going to prevent you from doing either intentionally or by mistake, preventing you from assigning null. Why are we not seeing a warning? Oh, you got an exclamation.
I put a bang on there. I told it to be quiet.
Yeah, no, I understand.
It tried to tell me not to do that.
Those
and I told
three
it
L's
to be
in a row, it just was confusing.
Yeah.
I couldn't see that.
I normally spell three
it
L's.
turns out that whenever you go ahead and have a public API where you have declared your intent that is not nullable, you should 99% of the time check whether the data is actually null or not. And so in actual fact, we want to validate, in this case, in line 28, we actually want to validate that first name is not null. And we can do it exactly the way that Kevin's done, using the autocomplete to go ahead and validate that it's not null, using the null coalesce operator. So it's now saying, if it's the first name, then go ahead and throw an argument null exception, and in this case, fill in the first name. Why is this not ideal?
So you have to fix the problem.
Well, we did in the constructor.
Right, but still at line 34,
Bad. It's almost like I left a large hint.
So the reason why this isn't great is because we haven't fixed the problem that you can still assign the property, which is the only thing that's actually public, to be null. So what is the point on us going ahead and assigning, what is the point on us going ahead and checking the parameter only and not, to what we assign to the field, but not doing it inside the property validation? And so the obvious choice here is we need to refactor. Let's go ahead and put the check for null inside the property rather than inside the field. And once we put it inside the property, then we can change line 28 to be assigned to the property rather than to the field. So we're going to go ahead and move that check up into the properties setter.
Okay, we're not going to get fancy. I was like, we could just one-line this, but we'll be explicit. Right? We'll do it longhand. Okay, quick plug. Anyone who doesn't have IntelliCode turned on, go turn it on immediately. Tools, options, preview features, check the box. It is legitimately autocode. It is awesome.
Except for when it says is.
Except for when it goes wrong. It goes wrong horribly, but it is awesome when it's right.
We've only had one case so far, and we've only written 5 lines of code, so you know, what the heck.
That's pretty good odds. 20%. That's a batting average right there. What a great one.
We still have a warning.
Yeah, we haven't fixed it.
What's the warning?
The warning is squawking about first name, specifically the
Okay,
field.
so we've gone through this. We've actually validated that first name, which is private, can never actually be assigned a value of null. However, we're still getting a warning. And I want to be clarified here. The coding guideline is you should never assign a field outside of the wrapping property. So that's the coding guideline. Don't assign a field outside of a property. Since we're only assigning it inside the first name property, we have validated that first name can never have the value of null. And yet, we still have a warning. This is stinking frustrating. Like, why should declaring a property be so stinking hard? Every single time we want to have a nullable property, it turns out it's fairly complicated code. Number one, you need to check for null. And number two, we're still ending up with a warning. Suggestions on how to deal with the warning? Reese.
Make the string not, null.
Make the string not null.
Yeah.
How do you do that?
Well, I guess at what point are you saying make the string not null?
Which string?
Declare the data type.
It is declared as not.
It is declared
Yeah,
as not.
no question marks on either of these.
So the suggestion was declare the string as not null, and both of them, by default, because we use string and not string question mark, they are declared as not null. In fact, that is the very reason we're getting the one. What was that?
A new C# feature.
We need to go
Convenient.
ahead and change the compiler to do this differently.
I think there's an easier solution than changing the compiler.
There would be in this case, yeah. There would be in this case.
Though that is an option.
So Reese is almost there.
I mean, you could make your field nullable.
Yes.
If you know you're setting non-null into it.
Yes, yes.
But then it's going to yell on line 17.
So make the field
Yes.
nullable, but
So-
then it yells on line 17. So then the question is how to handle it.
So here's the problem. First of all, we know that first name should never be null. We've gone ahead and said, in spite of the fact that that is true, we're actually declaring the field as nullable in order to avoid the warning that occurred in the field. However, we know, because it is always only accessed from the property, that we can do that as long as we prevent null ever being put in there. However, now when we go ahead and return underscore first name from the getter on the first name property, we're getting a warning.
Now we can just throw
So now we can just go throw a null forgiveness operator at the end of first name, and finally we have a property that checks for null and verifies that it can never be set to null, and it has got rid of all the warnings.
So it's important to call out under which conditions this actually matters. So this is specifically when you have a property that contains either a setter or an init, effectively something that's going to be set elsewhere, right? That contains validation. Obviously, if this property were nullable, we wouldn't need to have these extra null checks. This would not be a problem. But in this case, we've declared an intent of non-null. There's some validation logic in here. We want to keep our validation logic condensed into one place. For example, if somebody decides that maybe empty string is no longer valid, we don't want to have to go and make that check in multiple places. So if we were to do it in the constructor where we had it before and in the property, well, now we've got our validation in two spots, and you end up changing it twice.
So the guideline here is if you're going to declare a non-nullable reference type, so it must be, we're talking about a reference type only, declare a non-nullable reference type, this is the guideline for how to go ahead and do that. Assuming you got validation, which I think is a reasonable assumption. I can't imagine why you wouldn't do the validation. And you have to go sort of do this sort of field declared as nullable, bang operator returning from the getter, have the nullable check inside the setter, and you should be all set to go. And then you got to assign this property from the constructor.
That's a lot of ceremony.
That is a lot of ceremony.
So the comment, yeah, it's a lot of ceremony. The question is, which of those rules do you not, which one of those guidelines would you want to say is not worth doing? And it seems to me that if you're going to choose not to check the property, there's no point in declaring it as not nullable. So the reality is, if you're going to go ahead and validate state on your object, or in this case your property, I can't imagine not doing it inside the property. And there's one other criteria. It has to be read-write.
Right. It needs to have a set or an init.
A set or init for the property. So we talk about a nullable reference type property that is read-write. And it could be read-write either during construction or post-construction in both cases. Now, if we only had the init case, would it be reasonable for us to only initialize in the constructor? So if we change that to init, would it be saying, oh, well, now we can just check it in the constructor? For those of you who aren't familiar, init is a C#9 feature. Is that, yeah.
Yep. C#9, and to be clear, that.
Oh, but you just gave the answer.
No, I didn't.
Oh, okay, yeah. So in the C#9 case, when you declare something as init, what that means is this can be changed any time until the constructor has completed execution, which is also allowed during an initializer of your object. But if we only checked for the value inside the constructor and not inside the init or the setter, then we could actually go ahead and initialize it with a null value and because it was never checked. So even in the init case, we can't get away with just checking the constructor. The only case we could get away with just checking the constructor is if it's a read-only property. If we do a read-only property, we could get away with not initializing in the setter. We could only initialize in the property. But now we're choosing between a unique corner case and saying, oh, well, I can do initialization check inside the constructor rather than inside the setter. And I'm not sure you'd be saving that much code, and you would be introducing I've got to remember the corner case to go ahead and do this. There is one other thing that's worthwhile pointing out in terms of using the null coalesce operator for doing the assignment and throwing the exception. So instead of doing your if check there on 20 through 23, what if you just went and assigned value?
Sorry, did what?
Assign value if it's not null,
Oh.
and then throw the exception.
So, I mean, you can't get away with this, but I think what you're proposing is, right?
And this is only true in our case because we also got the check afterwards. So you could, if you wanted to make the code a little bit more succinct, you could go ahead and assign value that way. Why can't you get away with?
You can. It just looks really weird to have value equals
Fair
value.
enough. And it's
Discard. We're going to use C#9.
You could go to that way. I think that's harder to read. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I'm just saying it's harder to read. So you choose your poison where you want to. But I think that's probably a more succinct version. It's not necessarily as readable. But that is a completely valid way to go ahead and check for the value.
No, completely unreadable would be if you decided to be crazy and say that. That's the unreadable version.
That doesn't come out.
Get the parens right.
Okay, questions. The comment I think I heard from Jenny and Kelly was this: there's a lot of ceremony, and I agree with you. I'm just not sure how to eliminate any of it. And what I'm really wanting is the ability to do this in a more succinct way in the language. Is this a good time to talk about color expressions?
It could be. One quick comment before you deviate us too far. So one of the easy ways around this is to say, well, this problem only comes up when I've got effectively a read-write property. So the solution is go fully immutable. Now I have no read-write properties, problem solved. Right? That is a solution, and if you're the Roslyn team, the solution. And with C#, especially with 9 and then in 10, you get records, which seem to give you that first-class support for mutability to make it less needful to do this.
But you still need to make the check for whether somebody is assigning null. Mm-hmm. And by default, on a record struct, it is read-write by default.
Right, which bites you. And the other thing to be aware of, and also going back to what we had talked about earlier with checking for null, the moment you switch into a record, you run into the case where record overrides your equality operators by default. And that can lead you into all kinds of fun pain and suffering when you did not expect equality to be member-based.
You think I'm getting off track?
Carry on.
I thought we weren't going to talk about records because we're just going to bring all sorts of other things.
I did say that. But it's worth noting, that is, like, record is one of the good justifications for doing is null, though. Yeah. Is because when you legitimately want to check is an instance null, you want to actually make sure that you aren't accidentally landing in that overridden equals. And record is the easy use case. With a few characters, somebody magically overrode all the equality operators.
C#10 has a preview feature where you can decorate a parameter, well, you can decorate any type with a bang bang after the data type, which then injects a null check at runtime, but the feature is only in preview and it will be removed by the time C#10 goes live. So it's not something you should want to take a lot of advantage of. I would suggest that the feature is less than ideal because it only deals with nullability check-in, and I'd love to see the ability to do parameter check-in that's not limited to check-in for nullability. So I'd like to see a more generic approach. I'm not saying what's going to happen in the future or anything that's going on in that space, but I'd love to see we have a more generic approach to parameter check-in. And one way to do that is to start using
more C#10, more C#10.
More a C#10 feature called caller expressions, caller attribute expressions. Caller.
Somebody just needs to find where he left it. Don't worry, it will be here somewhere. Where the heck did I put it?
We can write it.
Yes, but based on how well I wrote it from scratch last time, we're going to copy and paste. Oh.
So let's imagine the case that we go ahead and write a new data type. In this case, we're going to call it guard. And what it does is it validates parameters. So it goes ahead and does validation of parameters. At a minimum, we want to go ahead and validate a parameter to check whether it's null or not. And it turns out that one of the difficulties with doing this in the past is that when you went ahead and checked the value for null, the only thing you wanted to check was the parameter. The only value you wanted to pass into the expression was the parameter itself. But when you passed in the parameter, you couldn't throw a null reference, you couldn't throw an argument null exception and know what the data type or the name of the value was that was actually not null. So you can imagine a method that has 4 parameters and all of them are not null. You want to check each of them. So you go ahead and call a not null method and you pass in just the parameter only. But inside the method that checks for not null, it's going to throw an argument null exception and not going to know what the name of the argument was. because the parameter coming into the expression is always the same one, and so you don't know how to do it. C#10 introduces a new feature called caller argument expression, and what the magic that it does is it actually allows you to go ahead without writing any code to have a handle to the name of the argument that you're passing in, or more generically, the expression that was specified in the call. So if we go to use this, we're going to go ahead and use not null or guard not null inside our first name. Yeah, that's great. We're going to do guard not null.
G-U-A-R-D.
Tab.
See, it knows what I
did.
see. Now it's wrong.
Value.
See, and now it thinks I want to do a name of. Bad. It's trying to be so helpful.
So what's interesting about this case is the not null method goes ahead and checks that the value is not null. But more importantly, when it throws an error, it also knows that the value passed in, these words are really difficult, is called value.
In retrospect, we should have done this somewhere different.
Yeah, maybe we should put it inside the constructor, I don't know.
How do you use value in a fourth way?
So here, what's most important is the value, the expression passed into not null is first name. You'll notice that in the not null method, there are actually two parameters. The first parameter is the expression that you passed in, which in this case is just first name. The second parameter is called the argument expression, and that automatically gets injected by the C#10 compiler to be the string that you put in for the value, so that now when we throw the argument null exception, we know what the string was, and it's not just one parameter name, it could be an entire expression. And that's automatically injected in, so now we don't have to go through with, so now we can do sort of parameter check-in, and we can go put a whole bunch of parameter checks inside our guard class, and now we've got a one-word way, or almost one-word way, basically a method invocation, to go ahead and do parameter validation. Now, it's the nice thing about this ability to do this is that we can now start doing parameter validation without doing if it matches this regular expression, if it's not null, if it's not null or empty, if it's not null or white space. You know, all those kinds of things that we prefer doing, which is fairly verbose language that always cluttered up the top of our methods. We can now make one method expressions to do that. We can imagine, I'm not making any suggestions, you can imagine turning this into an attribute on the class or something like that, but really we're not gaining a lot just by being able to put that word in there with a one method invocation. We get down to fairly succinct a parameter validation on the things that we're doing.
And the other thing, we've written this with string as the argument going in, but you are not limited to that. This ends up being sky's the limit, write whatever you'd like. For people who are familiar with like the iNotify property change, the old attribute that's been around since C#4, caller member name, this operates very similar to that, where the compiler is effectively looking at the call site and saying, oh, okay, I see what you passed in. I know how to make a string that looks like that. Ka-thunk. Pass that in, and away you go.
If that's functioning the same as like caller member name, you could easily make not null an extension method.
Hold on real quick. If that's functioning the same way as caller member name, you could easily make that an extension method. Carry on now. Sorry, I'm just trying to repeat.
No, go ahead.
I honestly have no idea what the heck that is going to do. Because I somewhat suspect I end up getting a...
So it's kind of weird calling
we would not be
an
the first
extension method on something that is null.
Sure.
But doable.
Yes, no, I understand.
It's almost like one of those things that you should never do, but occasionally do.
So my question is it better? Is it better to say first name dot not null or not null take pass in a parameter first name? I'm not sure that we're gaining, but the more important part is that are we now going to go create an extension method on object? Because really, this isn't limited to string. This is something we want to do on all reference types. And I'm very hesitant to go ahead and do extension methods on something like object and make it that generic. Whereas to go ahead and write a guard.notNull that takes object makes a lot more sense to me. So I'm actually fairly uncomfortable with that idea. What is interesting to me is I think going ahead and moving guard into be a static declaration in your namespace so that you just have to call not null is fairly intriguing to me. So we could actually eliminate the guard dot because we can go ahead and move guard into a static declaration at the top, and now we don't have to prefix with guard. And another interesting thing is that in C#10, those namespaces that you happen to put in your file, you can now declare them as global, and so now you only need to write them once for the entire project. And so now I could go sort of foist those sort of declarations to be global and only write them once for the entire project, and that seems really useful. Now, I want to be careful about collisions. What if somebody else has a name code not null? There's a whole bunch of things that we need to be careful of in terms of the ambiguity, but it's intriguing for the possibilities that you could create to go do that. I mean, I could even go as far as imagining that we sort of turn it into lowercase not null, both lowercase not null. So now it looks almost like a keyword, and we just can call not null and then pass it in. Again, these are just ideas to sort of conceptualize. I seriously doubt the language designers are going to do much because one of the primary, if not the primary case for language change is backwards compatibility. And they put an awful lot of effort into making sure backwards compatibility is maintained, even to the point of not giving us nice features because it would lose backwards compatibility. And so that has a high priority in terms of language design.
I have no idea why the using static isn't working. Regardless, for all I know, it's something I've done.
That should work.
I agree it should work, but there's sort of a lot of variables at play.
Okay.
Like somebody installing preview bits.
Questions? Questions?
Brian wants to know if this is still an extension method.
It is not an extension right now.
It is no longer an extension method.
Was that why not null was not working?
Oh.
Because it's ambiguous as to what you're calling?
Oh, Brian might be wise. Ah, ha, ha.
Well, let's not exaggerate. Do we know this, Brian?
That's a good question.
We do,
You know this, Brian? Okay. Points of order, Brian. Spot on the mark. That's
okay.
why you don't declare
Any
this
other
as
questions
extension method.
for what we covered so far? It's probably worthwhile at this point to go into the property change notification and sort of talk about changes in that space.
Yeah. So previously, if people had gone through, like events in C# are something that have been around since the beginning. They're not overly used a lot because there can be fraught with peril with memory leaks and null checks. And so a lot of people, if you've written...
Well, they're not used that much in new stuff, but they are
Right,
very prevalent throughout a lot of code.
There are a lot of events in old code. I will agree with that. And so if you've written events in the past, or you might be working in code bases, a very common approach to dealing with events was very similar to what you see up on line 13, where you declare an event and you assign it to an empty delegate. Does anyone know why people would have written code that way? Has anyone done this? I see heads nodding, but nobody's willing to speak up. Perfect.
So you don't have to null check it later.
So you don't have to null check it later, because down here with events, when you register and unregister for them, once you unregister the last handler, the event itself goes to null, and this ends up throwing a null reference exception on you.
Would you declare it as read-only?
Did I
No, would you?
declare this? I don't think you can.
curious.
So you'll note here that this thing is already throwing a warning on me, specifically calling out that the nullability on my event doesn't match the interface. And so this is one of the things to be aware of, especially as you start upgrading projects. Nullability got introduced in C#8
Nullable reference types.
nullable
right?
reference types, and that was .NET version 3.1, I think, was the first one that had any decorations. I think.
I think that's right.
And then
Yes.
with .NET 5 and
.NET Core 3.1.
.NET Core 3.1, thank you. And then with Net 5 and Net 6, Microsoft has gone through and started adding nullable annotations, effectively the question mark, to as many APIs as they possibly can. With Net 6, it is very close to 100%. I don't remember the exact number, but it's pretty much the entire BCL library that you'll run into. But it is worth noting, as you upgrade from, say, a 3.1 project to a 5.0, you will probably start seeing more nullability warnings as you go, simply because the library under the hood now is decorated, and it's now able to communicate intent. In this case, what it is squawking at is it knows that my event really should be declared like this.
Right, I mean, just to be clear in this case, the warning here is, hey, you've gone ahead and declared it as not null, sorry.
Right, you've declared it as non-null, and more importantly, the interface declares it as null. So this is something that propagates up through your object hierarchy as you go. Rather than...
I just want to make sure we're clear. The I_notify property changed declaration declares property, the property changed event handler as nullable explicitly rather than not null, which is why we have to actually go change this when we add nullable support to our project.
So the other thing that you can do is rather than declaring an empty delegate on everything, and this goes back down to the option that we had before.
Can you show us the warning on that before you put the invoke?
Oh, sure. So once we declare it as nullable, and because it's not being initialized to anything, the compiler now knows, just like we saw with the field, that right when you do new person, the initial state of this thing before anybody's registered is a null event. So just like the field, you end up with a warning if all you have is an invocation of the event, saying, hang on, if you get down to here before somebody's registered, things are going to go boom.
What's your warning?
Well, this one here I'm pretty sure is dereference of possibly null reference.
So
which sounds like bad.
I just want to talk about the transition in your code. So that you're going ahead and turned on nullability, which meant that we're now going to go ahead and get a warning on the declaration of the property changed event. The property changed event is saying, hey, it doesn't match the interface because the nullability intention needs to be also with a question mark. So we go ahead and put a question mark to get rid of the warning on the declaration of the event. Once we do that, we're now saying, hey, you're invoking property change, but you haven't checked for null. So another warning shows up saying you haven't checked for null on that. And so now it's asking us to go ahead and change that. And so if we go ahead and do that warning.
So the obvious option is there, and then the null propagation to handle the null case.
And because we've done, to handle the null case. Well, notice the other thing that you don't need to do when you do this type of declaration is you no longer need to assign the delegate to another value to worry about a different thread changing the value after you've checked for null. It turns out that the question mark dot operator there is atomic, so that you can't have somebody else go ahead and insert or change the value to be null outside of the case. In this case, it's not really valid because it's an event which is declared as private anyway. So inside your class is the only way you could do that. But it is an important thing to be aware of, that it could end up being null. So the end result is, we have to check that the value has changed before we throw the event, but other than that, we can just do a question mark dot invoke to go ahead and do that. And that's all part of the nullability support. Actually, that was not even required for nullable reference types, but nullable types that came out, C#5, I think roughly around there, that we could do that question mark period operator.
Null propagation.
Thank you.
Huzzah.
So you can comment out that one. We don't need that anymore, right?
Yeah, this is the old way of doing it.
Yep.
Don't do it anymore. You may come across code like that. Just switch it. Trust me. You'll be happier. You'll save yourself like 2 IL calls.
What's next?
Attributes?
Oh, yes. This is an important one. We've already showed you that part of the way nullable reference types work is that it goes ahead and decorates the data type that is nullable with an additional attribute, so that you can indicate to people that are invoking you and calling you, hey, my intent is that this is nullable or not nullable as part of your declaration when I go ahead and do that. But there's some corner cases that are fairly interesting and problematic. For example, imagine if we want to go do maybe a try parse. And in the try parse case, we want to say, hey, if we successfully can parse this, then the data coming back will not be null. So we have to declare it as nullable, because if we can't successfully parse it, the data coming back is going to be null. It's going to be null. But if we do successfully parse it, then we want the data to come back as not null. And so there needs to be some way at the compiler level to declare and say, hey, when this value coming back is true, I guarantee that the value stored that was parsed is not going to be null. And that's something that the compiler could know. Hey, if we are successful in parsing, we want to tell the caller that they don't need to check for null, they don't need to do a null collapse or anything like that. They can just assume that the value works. And so we need to have some way to go ahead and declare a method that gives that. So in this case, we're going to go ahead and parse name. So let's imagine that the person we can pass in a full name, we're going to again parse it to be first name and last name coming out. Go ahead and assign those. And the issue we're going to get in the caller case, when you go ahead and call parse name, which we'll do from the constructor.
Hang on.
No, you're doing great.
Okay.
We're going to make some assumptions to the validation here.
Yeah, we're going to assume that nobody ever has a space in their name. That's not a good assumption.
No, we're going to
make.
assume that they always have a space in their name, and only one.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, fair. Boom.
Okay,
Flawless
thank you.
logic.
That was fantastic. Nice job with that. You didn't even use a cut and paste. That was really impressive.
I considered it.
Can you invoke that from your line 41 there? Can you go ahead and invoke that?
No, but I can do it from here.
42.
It is 42. That was very
Correct.
good. Thank you.
Thank you for noticing. I appreciate that. So for people who are unfamiliar with it, there is newer C# syntax where you can declare your out variables in line rather than having to do weird stuff like declare them ahead of time. It's functionally the same way. It's just cleaner.
So now what we want to be able to do from in here is go ahead and assign first name, the property, with the value that is stored in first name. And you'll notice as soon as we do that, we can do the same as last name, but just notice as soon as we do that, we're going to get a warning. It's going to say, hey, how do you know that first name is not null? And it turns out we know for sure if we successfully parsed, then first name is never going to be null. How do we tell the compiler that that's the case? You guys understand the problem, right? We know logically that this will never be null, and now we need to tell the compiler. And it turns out there's an attribute you can add to your method that appears on the return to say this is not null when the value returned, in this case, is going to be true.
I'm going to correct what you said. There's an attribute you can put on the out parameter, not on the return.
Oh, because we're returning the data through out parameters. Thank you, I appreciate that. You
I
could put it on the,
I
you could put it
realized
on the
what you were
return.
going
Doesn't make
for.
any sense.
And
I take that back. You couldn't put it on the return.
not
Anyway,
in this case. A bool will not be null.
yes.
In most cases.
So by doing that, it automatically checks that the return from this method is a bool, and when the bool is true, the data will not be null. And now if we go up to the caller, you'll notice there's no longer a warning.
Is that string is null or empty is using?
String is null or empty. So that's not the attribute on string is null or empty, but this is the attribute that's on all of the like
Triparse
BCL
methods.
triparse methods. So ints, squids, enums, etc.
Compiler knows about this.
It knows about is null or empty. There's a slightly different attribute there to communicate out what the intent is there, so that it knows that if you do an invocation of string is null or empty or is null or white space, that is effectively a null check. So if you wanted to write your own null checking method so that it knew after this invocation, hey, I know this is not null, or not null when, etc.
It turns out that this is not a unique, it is returning not null when is a specific case where we've used it in the triparse, but there's a whole host of attributes that you can actually use that give you the ability to do different kinds of logic that match similar types of scenarios. So if we pull up the URL, is that the best way to show this?
Yes, if I had it open, but conveniently,
source
well, it is in source code. Yes, keep talking. Pretend no one sees anything.
So if we go ahead and pull up this URL, there's a whole host of these that you can go ahead and look up and just become familiarized with them. Some of them are fairly rare, quite honestly. They're not common cases. They're common cases in the BCL, but not common cases that we would necessarily encounter. But it's good to look through this list of different attributes to go ahead and capture the scenarios. And what you're doing here is trying to eliminate the users of your library from having to go ahead and use things like the null forgiveness operator, because you know it's not going to be null even though it is. So in this case, we could have easily assigned the property first name with equals to the parameter first name decorated with a null forgiveness operator. exclamation point. But rather than forcing your user to do that, you can use a whole host of these attributes and use them inside your methods as well as you could write the methods. Reese.
I like not null if not null.
So, okay, so comment. So the comment was, I really like the ability to do not null if not null. What you're really saying is, if the parameter passed in is not null, then what I'm going to send out is not going to be null. So that's a good example where when you want to go ahead and do that. So for example, I could say something like, hey, if you send me the string 42 as in 42 spelled out, I can return 42. It is not going to be null as long as what you passed into me is not null. Again, it's a case.
Was there any constraints around where you put that attribute?
So the question is, are there any constraints about where you can put those attributes? And yes, for example, most of them you can't put on a class. They don't make any sense in a class. Are there constraints? I don't think there's ability to constraints on return or parameters.
No, there are, and that's actually so this has existed for a long time, since C# early days. But if you want to decorate up an attribute on the return value rather than on the method, you can prefix your attribute with return colon. So there's kind of a host of these. Most people instinctively have already seen these, typically with assembly level attributes for like file version, where you prefix your attribute with assembly colon. But you can do the same thing with return types with return colon if you intend for the attribute to be applied to the return type, not necessarily the method itself. Because without that, the attribute there then gets applied to just the method.
But back to the question that Reese is asking is, are we limited as to where we can use them? And the answer is yes.
All of these attributes do have attribute usage declared on them. Because some of them, like that last one, only make sense on parameters. So for example, if we dive in and look at this, just pop this open, you'll see attribute usage, not null when, only is applicable to parameters. So, for what it's worth.
There are also ones that are confusing. For example, you can declare a type as not null and go ahead and decorate with a disallow null. I mean, as nullable, you can declare a type as being nullable and then go ahead and put a disallow null in it. So there's a bunch of attributes like that allow you to do magic. For example, we could on our field, in the case that we declared our field as nullable, we could go ahead and decorate with a disallow null so that people don't mistakenly assign null. I don't think you need to, because you're in control of all the code. You only access it from inside the property, but you could certainly decorate the field, which as null, you can make the field nullable so that you get rid of the warning, but then decorate with a disallow null so that nobody mistakenly goes and assigns it null.
Right, or similar, like you can see their allow nulls sample here that they've got, where they've declared their property as non-nullable, because the intent is that screen name in this case will always have a non-null value, but they are allowing null to go in simply because they are handling the null case and will put in a default with their null coalesce on the way in.
Another case where you want to do this is we've gone ahead and declared, we're not using attributes, but on the caller expression case, we went ahead and declared that using, Kevin's pulling it up. We went ahead and declared that as being nullable, the string as being not null, and then we assigned a null. This is the case where we're doing opposite what I intend, so our code is literally assigning null. We're saying, forgive us, we're going to do null, because we know that the compiler will inject the correct value for us when we go ahead and do this, but we never actually expect that value to be null.
One of the cases where those attributes come up a lot is when you start writing generic methods, specifically generic methods that lack constraints. The moment you put a constraint on it where you say where T is class, where T is struct, okay, we can start inferring some stuff about it. But now you run into this case where when you say where T is class, well, what does that mean? Is it a nullable class or not? What do I allow coming in? So there are additional generic constraints for not null as well, or attribute decorations. And it really depends on your individual method and the use case of which one makes sense. But be aware that those things exist for when you run into that. They usually crop up in that last 20% that I was talking about, where it's not as simple as just add question mark or delete it. Yeah.
It's not that you need to memorize the whole list because it's a large list. It's when you
don't memorize it.
It's when you can't figure out how to decorate your code in such a way that allows the user to use it without having to deal with nullability, or you keep having warnings and you want to get around them. That's almost the case. Oh, that means I need to go look for an attribute that'll help me get around this. Unfortunately, there's not the one on the property, which is why we show sort of the gymnastics you're jumping through in order to declare a non-nullable read-write reference type property.
Yeah, so one other thing to note as well is we're showing off things here. I'm running latest preview bits and all of that, but I imagine most people are probably not in projects that are running latest preview bits that drop today. Most of you are probably on something that resembles stable. Because this is a compiler-based feature, as long as you are running on, or I should say, as long as the developers are running on newer tooling, and by newer tooling like VS 2019, in some version of it, I don't remember exactly which, you can actually use this on projects that are targeting older frameworks. So specifically to bring this in, you need the attributes to be declared. The attributes do not even need to be declared public. You can find references to the source code of them, or there's source-only NuGet packages that you can download as well that will just bring those attributes in for you. That way you have access to them and can start leveraging them. As long as the compiler sees an attribute with the right name and the right namespace, it'll pick it up and play along happily.
What's also interesting about this is in order to support backwards compatibility, the nullable attribute is actually generated, injected into your code, redefined. So if we go pull up that IL again, I think you still got it open. This is really a weird scenario to look at. But if you go look inside that, you'll notice there's a system.runtime.compiler services decorated right within this compiler, assembly. They've gone ahead and written code that generates the nullable attribute and the nullable context attribute because of beta, so that you can get these types even if you're referencing libraries that don't have them, which is a really weird thing to do, but they give you the best backwards compatibility by doing that. But it is a weird thing to see. The first time I saw this, I was like, wait, what? They're redeclaring a system type within your assembly? So it is kind of strange.
Yeah. The last thing to be aware of is that we spent all of this time saying that nullable reference types don't have runtime behavior, and that is mostly true. There's no runtime behavior inside of basic C# runtime. However, there are some common libraries that add runtime behavior based upon nullable reference types.
Just to clarify that, there's runtime behavior because it goes and looks at the attributes, so it doesn't change what you can do or assign the values, but there are things that go back and using something like reflection will look and find the attributes and then change the way they behave because they see that your data types are decorated with those attributes. And therefore they have different runtime behavior because at runtime they're examining the data. It's the most obvious example.
Yeah, a couple libraries people may have heard of, they're a little lesser known, but EF Core and ASP.NET Core.
Entity framework, that one?
Yeah, but I have to say
I've
core,
heard of it.
otherwise people get
Yeah.
confused with EF6. So with entity framework specifically, if you turn on nullable reference types, on your entities, it will use those as a nullability hint for the column in your database. So if you turn it on a project that is using EF Core, the easiest suggestion I have, turn it on, go and run a migration, and look at that migration. It will show you all of the columns that it is wanting to change on you, and those are the ones you need to go back and review because it's probably not what you intended, especially for things like string and whatnot.
If it goes and changes your string to now be not null, and you've got a whole bunch of nullable types in there, that may not be what you intended to have happen. And vice versa, when you went ahead and declared it as nullable, and now you're declaring it the other way, you're going to end up with some significant migration issues that might be disconcerting at best.
Yeah, and ASP.NET Core on your controller, like specifically like web APIs, where previously you would say slap a required attribute in front of a parameter to automatically check. Newer versions will look at your nullable reference types and know, oh, this is a non-nullable string. Well, let me go ahead and check that for you. Convenient, unless that wasn't your intent. So just be aware in both of those cases, if you turn on nullable reference types, you are potentially going to get runtime behavior. Obviously, if you've got other libraries you're referencing, check them, but those are the two most obvious use cases that only a couple people use here and there.
Questions?
And everybody throw it all at once. I think we're roughly at the end.
That's it. Thank you guys very much. I hope this was helpful.
We have one more thing.
Yes.
Nicole.
We have a raffle.
We have a raffle.
JetBrains subscription.
For a
all the
JetBrains
people
subscription.
all the people that are here?
I don't.
No, it's not.
Nicole,
on there.
It's for everyone in person and those online as well.
Wow.
just exclude all 3 connections that I have to the meeting because that kind of feels like cheating.
I think you get one with the MVP. You don't get another one.
like if I join the meeting 4 times, do I get 4 entries? Does that count?
No, our lucky winner is Adam. Hi.
Okay,
Adam.
great. Thanks everyone for joining us. We really appreciate it. Thanks for those who came remote and joined us, and thank you very much for those of you guys who are here in person. It is a lot easier to talk with an audience that is asking questions, and we appreciate you showing up. So thank you very much. Have a good night.
Except